Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA. It created a new bureaucracy called the NRA, National Recovery Administration, and Roosevelt put a man in charge of it, named General Hugh Iron Pants Johnson. That was his nickname, Iron Pants. He was a red-faced, bully-type professed admirer of Benito Mussolini. At that time in history, Mussolini wasn't known yet for doing mischief in Ethiopia or with Hitler. He was not yet early on the stage in a big way. But he's known because he is a central planner. He made the trains run on time in Italy. So goes the myth, you know, which we now know is not true. They didn't run on time. But he had the impression, he gave the impression that he's in charge. He told people what they needed to do for the economy to work. And so that's the thinking behind the New Deal, behind the NIRA in particular. We got to issue orders to make the economy recover. Specifically, the thinking behind the National Industrial Recovery Act was that there was too much competition in the economy. The administration saw these plummeting prices everywhere. Well, of course, we're contracting the money supply, closing off world markets, raising taxes. Of course prices are going to plummet. They thought, well, the answer then is raise prices. And they looked around and they saw, well, every time some businessman gets prices up a little bit, some other guy comes along and undercuts him. And we're back on the swing. We got to get businesses singing out of the same hymn book and raising their prices in unison. And the only way we can do that is by cartelizing American industry, having codes and mandates that force prices up. The NIRA and its bureaucracy, the NRA, raised the costs of doing business on average by some 40%. And a famous example that I cited in this little essay, one of the most colorful examples of somebody prosecuted under it, was a tailor named Jack Magid, M-A-G-I-D. He was prosecuted because he pressed a suit of clothes for 35 cents instead of the NRA official code price of 40 cents. This is done throughout the economy in the name of economic recovery, but without recognizing that, look, one guy's price is another guy's cost. So you raise this guy's prices by decree, you just raise that guy's costs over there. This is redistribution through edict and mandates and silly declaration. So the NIRA was complete with all kinds of hoopla and fireworks and parades, and it had its symbol, the Blue Eagle, and businesses were supposed to put the sticker in their windows to show they're with the president, you know, we're all in this together, we're going to force prices up and cause recovery to happen. It was ludicrous. But if you think that was something, let me tell you about the other pillar of the New Deal, the AAA. This is almost unimaginable in hindsight. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. Don't you love the names they give these things? They can be the most destructive things that come down the pipe, but they assign nice-sounding names to the National Industrial Recovery Act. Well, how can you be against that? Agricultural Adjustment Act. Well, God knows agriculture needed adjustment. The farmers were bankrupt, and even the farm, they needed adjustment. And this adjusted agriculture. In that sense, it was accurate. It adjusted agriculture. Like falling out of an airplane will adjust your neck. It levied a new tax on agriculture. That's what they needed, right? Deep depression. Oh, put a new tax on it. It levied a new tax on agriculture, specifically millers, refiners, processors, and used the money to pay for programs to destroy perfectly good fields of wheat, corn, and cotton, and perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs. Mass destruction. Just one order from Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace called for, and it was implemented, the destruction of 6 million baby pigs. All in an effort to reduce supply and raise the price, and thereby bring recovery from depression. That was the theory. I wish I could stand before you as an economist and say, this is the way you get things moving. You destroy things of value. I wish I could say that with a straight face and believe it, because that is easy to do, it can be fun. thing the government does best, but it is not the road to prosperity. We labor, we sweat, we take risks, we invest in order to produce. And when you've gone through that and then you destroy what you produced, you've set yourself back. You haven't promoted or pushed yourself forward. It's as simple as that. But that was the theory. Lay waste to production and we'll somehow have recovery. But, you know, it meant, of course, the farmers had less to sell. They got a higher price for it, but they had less to sell. But even if it had helped the farmers, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. This is redistribution through destruction. There was a farmer whose testimony got some headlines, and to this day it's often cited in stories of the Depression. A farmer who complained because he couldn't train the mules, his mules, to do what Congress wanted done. He had trained his mules, like other farmers had done, to walk between the rows. But now, to carry out the government's orders of destruction, he had to teach them to stomp on the rows. And he couldn't get the mules to do that. They just had it so deeply ingrained in them that you don't walk on this green stuff. Now, what does that tell you about the relative intelligence of the mules of the day and the politicians of the day? Here the politicians say, stomp on this stuff, and the mules are smart enough to say, no, there's something wrong with that. Now, the economy will reel under the impact of these two horrifically stupid pieces of legislation. But we get some relief. And the economy actually shows signs of life in late 36 and into 37, part of 37, until we see a huge collapse, renewed collapse, a new depression within a depression in 1937. First, let me ask you, does anybody know why, after almost 2 years of this New Deal stuff, about 2 years, we actually, after that, start to get some life in 36 in the economy? Anybody know why? Because the Supreme Court came to our rescue and threw out both the NIRA and the AAA, declared them both unconstitutional, wiped the books of them, threw them out in their entirety. And the result was that, freed of the worst of FDR, the economy started to liven up a little bit. Unemployment fell below 20% in late 36. What happens in 1937, however, to take what seems to be a recovery and plunge us back into depression? We had the swiftest collapse in American economic history in 1937. And with it, Roosevelt achieved it first, a depression within a depression. What explains it?
The Dust Bowl?
What's that?
Was it the Dust Bowl at all? The Dust Bowl?
Oh, the Dust Bowl, no, that was an outgrowth of things like Smoot-Hawley and other stuff.
Gotcha.
It wasn't, and it was not a help, that's for sure. No, we call this fourth phase of your depression that explains the 37 collapse, the phase of the Wagner Act, W-A-G-N-E-R, and that will be the major factor that explains the 37 collapse. But it's the last one I'll mention because there's a couple other quick things I want to tell you about that contributed to the 37 collapse. The first one is the Supreme Court packing scheme. Roosevelt, of course, gets reelected in 36. You have to give him credit. You know, nothing was working, but he gets reelected by a landslide. He ran against a rather nice guy, but a colorless political figure from a small state, Alf Landon from Kansas, who by election day starts to sound like Roosevelt light. You know, I'll just do it better. I won't do it quite as much, but pretty much I'll do the same. You know, they didn't give people any choice. And so he lost every state but two, giving rise to that old phrase, which we've largely forgotten, but as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. Because those are the only two states he carried, he didn't even carry Kansas. So Roosevelt wins in a landslide, gives these wonderful fireside chats. People are convinced, well, it may not be working, but at least he's trying. And he decides with his new mandate, he can go after the Supreme Court. As he called them, those 9 old, I always emphasize that, those 9 old men of the Supreme Court who keep throwing out his cherished legislation. What can he do, though? He can't call for their impeachment.